Notice again what's coming up. This theological disaster surrounds a vision of God essentially portrayed as a divine despot, and concepts that undergird that notion, right? An appalling system of concepts. Notice the element two. It's a system where novelty, where self-correction, where critique, in some sense, have been banished. Right? He's very critical of this kind of theological vision of things. So now Whitehead is a great admirer of Scripture. Naturally, alongside the poets, he read the Bible in the original languages early on. He had a classical education. And so I'll take this one. He quotes the Scripture, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein." Who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts he is the King of glory. So he says, this is magnificent literature, but notice there's no solution here to the difficulties which haunted Job, aka evil, right? And he says the worship of glory arising from power is not only dangerous, it arises from a barbaric conception of God. I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the bones of those slaughtered because of men, and it is primarily men, intoxicated by its attraction. This view of the universe under the guise of an Eastern empire ruled by a glorious tyrant may have served its purpose. In fact, he says, even in its historical ascent, it marks an element of religious development, right? The psalm quoted gives us the noblest expression. The other side comes out, the psalms expressing hate. Psalms now generally withdrawn from public worship. The glorification of power has broken more hearts, heals too, than it has healed. Okay, so what you see again, this pushback at this barbaric, this emphasis on power in the doctrine of God, and then modeled it, if we want, in the coercion of human beings. So let's remember back that our first session we thought about Greek notions, right? The influence of Greek notions on Christian thought, and Whitehead, it really is looking back to the way in which these notions filter into how we understand the reality of God. Okay, and one is stated thus, okay? The notion of God as the unmoved mover is derived from Aristotle, at least so far as Western thought is concerned. The notion of God as immanently real is a favorite doctrine of Christian theology. The combination of the two into a doctrine of an aboriginal, eminently real, transcendent creator, at whose fiat the world came into being, and in whose imposed will it obeys, is the fallacy which has infused tragedy into the histories of Christianity and Islam, right? Again, very strong statements he's making, but notice some of the highlights, the attributes he's highlighting. Attributes of independence and immovability. Okay, attributes of being eminently real, right? Meaning most real, and everything else purely derivatively so. The attributes of being fully transcendent and unrelated to the world process. Okay, the language of fiat, of power, of omnipotence, the language of an imposed will on the world. So he's pointing to what we might say is the idolatrous entanglement of God and Caesar. Okay, notice how he says this. It's another one of the most famous statements of Whitehead in the Critique of the Tradition. Okay, when the Western world accepted Christianity, Caesar conquered, and the received text of Western theology was edited by his lawyers. The brief Galilean vision, right? He's referring to Jesus, Galilee. The brief Galilean vision of humility flickered throughout the ages, uncertainly. But the deeper idolatry of fashioning God in the image of an Egyptian, Persian, and Roman imperial rulers was retained. The church gave unto God the attributes which belong exclusively unto Caesar. Okay, it's a very famous statement, especially that last one, okay? But notice this charge of idolatry is essentially here as misrepresenting God and then believing it to be true, right? This is a big claim. It's idolatrous, he's saying, okay? But notice we mentioned too this element of the flickering Galilean vision, which tries to cut the world on fire, if you want, but only flickers and then burns out, only to flicker again at a different sort of age. So this element that's really at a major odds with what for him became the prevalent theological